If I were adding music to these videos, I'd be playing a requiem, a memorial to the end of the multi-regional model of recent human origins. If you watched the first two video parts of this story, maybe you're a little sad. How many people have a sentimental attachment to the multi-regional model? Well, don't worry, it's coming back, at least in a limited and modified form. But that's something at least. I said this previously, but I'm going to say it again because I really liked it. The multi-regional model in its original form has been convincingly falsified. But like a phoenix rising from the ashes of its own demise, its failure, along with other evidence, has contributed to a reevaluation of human evolution within Africa, and to a version of multi-regionalism within Africa that bears a certain resemblance to the falsified multi-regional hypothesis. Two-sentence review of the old story. One small group of human beings evolved in one small part of Africa 200,000 years ago, and part of that group left Africa 60,000 years ago to populate the globe. The more recent addition to that story, after that small group left Africa, they interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans. But wait a minute, what about what we just learned about mixing? There wasn't just one population of early humans in Africa, there were many. Are we really to believe that this one founding group of proto-Homo sapiens remained reproductively isolated from all other groups? Didn't mix? Didn't do that basic behavioral thing that human beings fundamentally do? Yes, we know that a fully human population left Africa probably several times, but definitively 60 or 70,000 years ago and dispersed around the globe. But how did that Homo sapiens population arise within Africa? Outside Africa, ancient populations that had separated hundreds of thousands of years before came back together again when the opportunity arose, and some of their genes were reintegrated into the Homo sapiens genome. This suggests that we ought to look very carefully within Africa. Why wouldn't there have been a similar process occurring within Africa too? So in a roundabout way, the success of the recent out-of-Africa model over multi-regionalism is its own undoing. It's out of Africa, but in multi-regionalism, the emergence of multiple groups might win out. This would be a kind of multi-regionalism within Africa, with mixings that ultimately led to one genetically unified population. Several lines of evidence support this new way of looking at things. First, where did we get this 200,000 year figure for the age of the human species in the first place? Through two lines of evidence. First, the early mitochondrial DNA evidence had suggested an approximate date of 150 to 200,000 years ago, based on mutation frequency, a molecular clock which I've discussed in a previous video. It turned out that that got into people's heads, but the information was flawed in ways that are beyond the scope of this video. More recent genetic evidence, which sadly or conveniently, depending on your point of view, is also beyond the scope of this discussion, is pointing to a considerably earlier date. So we're older than we used to think, and we need to be more flexible about the picture we paint about that long period of human emergence. The second piece of evidence that led us toward that 200,000 year figure was the dating of the earliest fossils in Africa that looked human-like. They seemed to fit that approximate 200,000 year timeline. But that's no longer the case. We now have a range of fossils from various regions in Africa that don't look fully human, but which vary in which parts look more human-like and which look more like older predecessors. A lot of interest has centered around the Jebel Irhoud skulls, which have recently been redated to 220 to 380,000 years of age. These have elongated rather than globular skulls, but human-like faces. They're not Homo sapiens, but there's a sense from these and other skulls of a coalescing over time into a more unified human structure. If this is true, there must have been an interchange among widely distributed populations within Africa that allowed populations with distinct morphologies to move towards commonality. It becomes impossible to know which contributions came from which population, just that the end result was a set of populations moving toward each other and ultimately into one genetically unified population. Other lines of evidence are found in the tools and artifacts used by various groups. In numerous regions in Africa during the period in question, the Middle Stone Age. There was an abandonment of the hand axes and cutting tools that had been prevalent for over 1 million years, and a shift toward more modern tools and toolmaking, the details of which are also beyond the scope of this discussion. Does this shift reflect the development of a new style of cognition? How much does the development of new material technologies across populations represent a sharing of these new styles? Or is the change in toolmaking more a matter of learning and innovation over time than of any cognitive advancement? Finally, in 2017, the paleoanthropology world woke to a surprise announcement. Maybe you recall the new finds in South Africa, now known as Homo naledi. These were discovered in a small cave in South Africa and required a team of small female paleoanthropologists skilled in caving and climbing in order to bring them out for study. These new fossils are definitely Homo, but quite divergent from Homo sapiens. These look so different from other Homo groups that the suspicion was going to be that they were quite old. But it turned out that they're dated from 236 to 335,000 years ago. Wow. So these guys were so different, and yet they were living during the period when Homo sapiens was evolving into its modern form. Was there mixing? Are these folks also part of our genetic heritage? Maybe, but no one knows. The broken hill skull that I showed in part 1, Homo heidelbergensis, has been recently redated to 125,000 to 300,000 years ago, raising the distinct possibility that there were multiple divergent Homo groups existing during the period of Homo sapiens evolution. And was there admixture? We need more fossils in general, and it would really help if we were able to get some high-quality ancient DNA from some of these specimens that correspond to these groups. So multiple lines of evidence are pointing to a new kind of multiregionalism. Multiregionalism within Africa. We have populations widely separated geographically within Africa, but with some level of mixing and gene flow. And ultimately, a human species that emerges is not the result of the signal success of one small group, but the consequences of hundreds of thousands of years of isolation and mixing within Africa. I have oversimplified. There are more resources about this stuff in the description. But we've come full circle. We started with utter confusion in the 1970s about the few ancient early human skulls and about how and where we emerged as human beings. Then two competing models emerged to explain our origins. One, the recent out of Africa hypothesis, prevailed. To me, this transformation in our understanding looks like a classic scientific revolution and represents an intellectual transformation of tremendous proportions. Out of that revolution came new perspectives and new questions that today are altering our basic understanding of human evolution and of the forces that operated to make it happen. To me, this is very exciting. Remember to subscribe, you can follow my Instagram, and as always, thanks a lot for watching.